Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching How Napoleon Subverted the Revolution by Kings and Generals. Now we've done a lot of videos on the military side of Napoleon's career, which I find absolutely fascinating, but today we will be digging into the political side of his career, which I think is equally interesting and something we don't talk about nearly as much. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
In 1789, the social fabric of Europe was thrown into chaos and disorder by the commencement of the French Revolution.
You could say that.
During which the people of France rose up against their king and oppressive nobility, demanding their voices be heard. Within 3 years, the monarchies of Europe were at war with revolutionary France in what would become the War of the First Coalition. It was during this war that the French monarchy would be abolished, and in its place would rise a new republic, idealizing liberty and fraternal equality.
Yes, idealizing liberty and fraternal equality, but not always quite achieving them.
However, as the French Revolutionary Wars raged on, a promising young French artillery officer would see his career skyrocket through the ranks of the Revolutionary Army and government until this man, Napoleon Bonaparte, would one day seize the reins of the revolution and subvert it for his own self-interests.
Yeah, and to be honest, even that framing is very loaded. There are a lot of debates from this time to the present day about what was Napoleon's relationship to the revolution. Did he continue it? Did he end it? Did he subvert it for his own means? I happen to think that that framing is largely correct. I think Napoleon was very self-interested. I think he did sort of subvert the revolution for his own ambition, but I do think that Napoleon had his own ideals, and he did believe in some of the ideals of the revolution. So, you know, as with everything Napoleon, it's complicated. I think there's a mix of personal interest, ambition, with some genuine principle. It can be hard to tell how much of each it is. I think it's usually more the ambition, but it's a complicated question. There have been endless debates about this, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a whole lot more throughout this video.
Welcome to our video on how Napoleon subverted the French Revolution. We're going to dive into all the details of Napoleon's story, but we also bring you a broader run through the whole tale from today's sponsor, Magellan TV, who feature Napoleon in an episode of their series The Great Commanders. It's an expert retelling of Napoleon's story, laced with analysis of what it was that made him stand out as a commander and what brought him so much success. From his rise amid the French Revolution, to his military conquest of Europe, to his downfall and ultimate knockout at Waterloo, Napoleon remains studied and sometimes idolized to this day as a man who climbed the rungs of power through talent.
He's a fascinating character. Like I said, there have been debates about Napoleon's legacy to this day. That's how you know you've left an influential legacy. You can look at someone like Caesar, for example, when people can't decide what your legacy is hundreds of years later. Yeah, you clearly made a lot of change. And yeah, Napoleon is idolized even today. I mean, he left behind him a great political movement that people would continue to follow, you know, Bonapartism, and it would find some success, mostly not, but you know, some people do continue to follow along with, if not his ideas, at least his style of governance.
But perhaps those rungs were also to shatter under his own weight, as his ambition turned his talent into tyranny. Get the full story now over on Magellan TV. Of course, there are also hundreds of other documentaries to watch there, and that's just counting history. There are loads of documentaries on all kinds of topics, all gathered together into one brilliant service, and more are added all the time. So for some high-quality history content, or whatever else you want to learn about, use our special link in the description, and Magellan TV will give you a month of access for free. The Corsican-born French army officer Napoleon Bonaparte, who initially signed his name in the Italian fashion of Napoleone di Buonaparte until 1796, was
You hear that? 1796. That is I mean, in the whole sort of story of Napoleon's great exploits, that is still pretty early, but, he's getting into his career at that point. And that is only when he decides to sign his name the way that we are very familiar with. It's just, I mean, it's maybe not a big deal, but it is sort of another example of Napoleon sort of crafting his image in a particular way. And the point I'm making is that, this is not how his name always was. It was Napoleon de Bonaparte, and then at one point he changed it. Interesting.
24 years old when his name first gained the notice of his contemporaries. The young artillery officer's first step in climbing up the social ladder of revolutionary France was not achieved through fighting on the battlefield with sword in hand, but rather by writing with the pen in the office.
Yeah, and I think this is something that people forget or don't know about Napoleon, is that, first of all, his first foray into any kind of public recognition was through his writing. He was a bit of an idealistic young Republican. In many ways, he believed, or at least purported to believe, in the ideals of the revolution. And even when we get a little bit deeper in, when we look at Napoleon's, say, defense of the Republican government that really shot his fame up, sure, that was a military activity, but that was sort of a very political action. So when we look at the early phases of Napoleon's career, yes, very military from early on, but very political, right? He really makes his initial steps into power through politics, through making a name for himself, through, meeting the right benefactors, through, at one point, saving the government. So that's a really interesting thing about his early career. And yes, he starts with his writing.
In 1793, Napoleon wrote a political pamphlet supporting the French Revolution, titled Le Souper de Beaucaire.
In 1793, at this point, we are deep into the revolution. The revolution's already gotten very violent and radical. So this is not a man who was, a 1789 moderate liberal who fell off when things started to go off the rails, I guess you could say. No, he stuck with the revolution. Now, it does seem like over time maybe he became more disillusioned and, clearly ended up doing things a different way. But I'm just trying to say that, yeah, he was a young radical revolutionary. He was not a conservative figure, at least at this point.
This pamphlet, which marked his first rise into public relevance, was a narrative dialogue between two travelers in an inn.
Yeah.
In this story, two merchants from Marseille attempt to convince their fellow inn guests, a soldier, an artisan from Montpellier, and a citizen of Nemours, how their city is justified in revolting against the revolutionary government in Paris. After a heated back-and-forth argument, the soldier ends the debate by proclaiming that the citizens of Marseille have no justification, whatever their grievances, in throwing their home country into a state of civil strife and chaos in the midst of a war against foreign invaders.
Bit of a self-insert character. I will say, you might think this is an odd way of delivering an argument, but in the Enlightenment era, the 18th century that Napoleon is writing in, this is a very common way to deliver an argument. It seems to me that a lot of these Enlightenment era writers never wanted to just say, I argue this is my thesis. It was always, a dialogue between two characters or a story or some sort of narrative, and you were to read the narrative or the dialogue, and through this, learn the argument, right? So Napoleon is writing very much in the style of his era. I mean, we think of someone like Voltaire, one of his greatest works is Candide. That is not a straightforward, argumentative piece. It is a narrative. It's a story through which he makes an argument. So Napoleon is doing what is normal at the time.
The soldier states that any refusal to obey the Jacobin government in Paris in such a trying moment is both treasonous and counter-revolutionary. Through this political pamphlet...
Though, through these types of narratives and dialogues, we often have self-insert characters where, like I said, the author doesn't want to just write out their argument, but they'll write a character that is delivering their argument, and many times they're writing themselves, basically.
Napoleon expressed his open support for the revolution, and directed his opposition towards the pro-monarchist regions of southern France. Napoleon's Le Souper de Beaucaire was by no means a historical groundbreaking work,
No.
but it did suit the dire circumstances surrounding revolutionary France at the moment it was written.
Yeah, and it gives you some sense of the context, right? This text, I haven't read it myself. Of course, I've read about it before. The main focus, not to say that Napoleon doesn't defend, say, the ideals of the revolution, but the main focus of the text is this argument that the Republic is under siege. We can't revolt now. We need to band together and support it. It's 1793. Gives you a good idea of where the French Republic is at, right? And, this gives you some idea or gives you some context for events like the Reign of Terror perpetrated by particularly Robespierre. Now, this is a really horrible and violent event, right? But it didn't happen for no reason. Nothing happens for no reason. There's always cause and effect. The French Republic is under siege by external enemies and also internal enemies, right? The revolts in the Vendée, royalist uprisings that are starting to pop up throughout France. I mean, these are real threats to the Republic. And in response, you get, say, a pamphlet like this, which is about defending the Republic from those threats. And you also get much more radical action, like the Reign of Terror under Robespierre, where he wants to exterminate both these external enemies through, external military action, and internal enemies through military action, repression. And of course, it becomes very extreme. And one of the things about trying to exterminate internal enemies is that it begins to become unclear who is an enemy and who's an innocent, and etc., right? It very much gets out of hand, and it is very violent. But, this does give you a sense of the place the French Republic is in at this moment.
For he had authored the piece while passing the time in General Jean-Baptiste de Carteau's army, which was operating against pro-Bourbon counter-revolutionaries in southern France. His pamphlet soon gained the attention of a close Bonaparte family friend, Antoine Christophe Salicetti, a fellow Corsican who held influence as a political commissar in the revolutionary government. Salicetti introduced the pamphlet and its author to his friend Augustin Robespierre, brother of the famous Maximilien Robespierre. Augustin appreciated Napoleon's Jacobin tone and pro-revolutionary message, and grew to like the magnetic personality of Napoleon.
Yeah, and I will say Napoleon had been doing some revolutionary activity in the Corsican side of things as well, but the reason this is so valuable is because if you think about the French military at this point, now the French military will end up seeing quite stunning success, which was very unexpected to many people because the French military had lost a lot of its leadership, a lot of its officers. Because if you think about the Ancien regime, the pre-revolutionary regime of France, and you think about its military, the leadership and officer corps was mostly made up of aristocrats. A lot of those aristocrats had either just straight up fled the country, become émigrés, or they had taken a bit of a step back, or they weren't to be trusted. And so the French military was looking for loyal, young military men. And I'm sure one of the things he saw in Napoleon was exactly that. Young, perhaps up-and-coming talent who was also loyal to the Republic. This is one of the reasons why you see so many people rising through the ranks of the French military during this era. A lot of spots have opened up, not only from, people dying in battle, but because a lot of the officers have straight up fled the country or do not want to participate in the military anymore. And Napoleon is one of those young men who is a beneficiary of this process.
Napoleon. And before long, he was approving of all of the young Corsicans' recommendations and ideas, even those policies which clashed with his military superiors. So began Napoleon's rise to prominence, from a lowly and obscure artillery officer to a name with some note and merit in the revolutionary ranks.
Yep.
Through his connections to Salicetti and Robespierre, Napoleon earned an appointment to the staff of General Carteau in the siege of Toulon in late 1793, where he first earned his reputation as a battlefield commander by leading.
And so first of all, interestingly, and this is a trend that will actually continue, we can see that Napoleon so far is sort of moving up due to his political connections. Now, of course, he makes a military name for himself in Toulon. That is one of, if you look at the big moments in Napoleon's early career, his pamphlet, which is often forgotten about, Toulon, and then his defense of the government from royalist rebels. These are the big three moments before we get to his like big military career, right? But how did he end up in Toulon? Well, it was because of his political connections, right? And so the political connections really essential at this point.
Leading the French Republicans to victory over the British and pro-royalist forces that December. He was hailed as a hero for his role in this victory and was quickly promoted to Brigadier General. However, Napoleon's connections to Robespierre were soon cut short, quite literally, when the latter lost his head to the guillotine in 1794 at the end of the Reign of Terror.
Yep.
As a colleague of Robespierre, and having previously been sent on a secret diplomatic mission to Genoa, an enemy of revolutionary France, Napoleon was made a suspect in the Terror and was thrown in jail by none other than his old friend Salicetti, who was trying to save his own head in the aftermath of the coup against Robespierre.
Yeah, Salicetti is sort of an early patron. Barras is the next patron in the lineup. But yeah, Napoleon, once again, I feel this early part of his career is often skipped over because he is basically a loyal Jacobin. Now, you know, how legitimately committed was he? With Napoleon, you never know, but I feel like young Napoleon was quite committed to the revolution and its ideals, like sincerely and legitimately. He is so close to the Jacobin leadership that he gets locked up. He's a suspect, right? I feel this is worthwhile highlighting because when we think about Napoleon's legacy, oftentimes we think about sort of the emperor, the authoritarian. And to many people, that does not seem particularly liberal, right? It seems a more conservative direction, taking France back into monarchy, basically. Sure, and Napoleon, his legacy is filled with contradictions, but it's worth looking at what he believed at this early part of his career, and some of this stuff he would continue to believe. Now, I do think over time he would step back from a lot of the Jacobin ideology, and he would become more moderate or maybe even more conservative on some things, but I do think some of these ideals he would hold throughout his life, and you can see this in the policy he would pass, particularly the policy he would pass, you know, when he would conquer other territories. So this is all really important to young Napoleon.
Any illusions Napoleon might have had about the ideals of liberty and common brotherhood in the French Republic were now being cast into doubt, with the brigadier now realizing the extent of the corruption and intrigue within the revolutionary government. Nevertheless, Napoleon continued to believe that the revolution was a cause for good within France.
So I think that's a little iffy because I just don't think we can exactly know what Napoleon continued to believe. You know what I mean? Was this the moment when he saw the problems with the government? I don't know. He definitely did. I mean, when we moved to the directory's a mess. It is a bunch of men looking out for only themselves. It is extremely corrupt. I mean, Napoleon could see that. I think that probably disillusioned him a lot. But what did Napoleon believe? What was going on in his head? We can't know. We just can't know. And Napoleon's sort of a particularly difficult guy to figure that out with, because he always has another angle, right? He's an ambitious guy. He's always looking to move up. Is he just saying something to make himself look good, or to impress somebody, or, you know, to move up a position? Or is he saying it because he believes it? I don't know.
Bonaparte was released from prison by his erstwhile friend Salicetti and put to work in the Army of the West, suppressing counter-revolutionary royalist revolts in the Vendée region.
And so I'm talking a lot, but I have a lot to say. Even in, if I remember correctly, this is a little fuzzy, but in Toulon, following, because Napoleon helps take back Toulon, which is a massive win for the French Republic, because Toulon had sort of given itself up to the British at one point. This was when France was really feeling, the Republic was feeling really under siege. You know, French leaders are giving themselves up to the British. Maybe it's all over, and Napoleon gets it back. If I remember correctly, there was sort of a terror after getting Toulon back, you know, a spree of executions against any collaborators, and I seem to remember Napoleon was very uncomfortable with that. He didn't want to participate. He was not on board with that sort of thing. So that might show you that, you know, even before the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Reign of Terror, Napoleon already had some serious qualms about the excesses of the Reign of Terror, or at least some of the extreme violence. So, it can be hard to track someone's ideological positions over time, like I said, especially with Napoleon. But if I'm remembering correctly, I think that gives us a hint of where he was at even before Robespierre and the Jacobins fell.
For some time, Napoleon actually considered transferring his military services to the Ottoman Empire, having become incredibly disillusioned with the poor management and chaotic administration of the revolutionary armies.
Right, and if he was becoming disillusioned in Toulon, or a little unhappy with how things were going, which is what I just said, then being sent to the Vendée, that would only make things worse, right?
By October of 1795, Napoleon was in Paris, working with the Bureau of Topography in the Committee of Public Safety, when a royalist revolt broke out against the ruling National Convention in the streets of Paris. Bonaparte continued to show his loyal convictions to the revolution's cause when he was tasked by convention leader Paul Barras with taking charge of Republican forces in Paris.
And Paul Barras was a big patron of Napoleon. So we looked at Salicetti, the Robespierre and his brother, and Barras is Napoleon's, and Salicetti is really Napoleon's patron in this early. They have that sort of Corsican connection. Barras is Napoleon's next big patron. He will shepherd, or at least give Napoleon some of the opportunities that he will get in the next phase of his career. And this is another massive point in Napoleon's development. Like I said, sort of the three big points are that pamphlet, Toulon, and then the defense of the government from this counter-revolution. And this is what really shoots Napoleon upwards, because this gets him a lot of political clout, wins him a lot of friends in the government, and wins him a lot of important opportunities.
And suppressing the riots. In one of the most notorious acts of his early career, Bonaparte ordered his artillerymen to fire grapeshot from their cannons into the gathered angry mob, violently suppressing the riot in an event that became known as the 13 Vendémiaire. Toulon had built Napoleon...
Well, that's the date, using the Republican-style calendar, which of course we don't use anymore, but sometimes you can follow that dating convention if you want it to sound a little exciting.
His early military reputation, while the 13 Vendémiaire had solidified his political career. Barras and other grateful leaders of the convention, who now formed a new government known as the Directory, hailed Bonaparte as a savior of the revolution. And before long he was promoted to the rank of General of Division, with command over the exhausted, ill-equipped and underperforming Army of Italy.
And there you go. And that's it, right? From this point onwards, this is when we really get Napoleon, the Napoleon that we all know, right? It's from Italy forward, where he really proves himself militarily. At this point, he gets sent to Italy, and he has had military success, Toulon mainly, but he's basically a political appointee. They don't appoint him for his military talent. They appoint him because he's saved the government, right? He's loyal to the government. And some of the officer corps of the Army of Italy initially is a little unsatisfied. They say, who is this guy, right? He doesn't have a great military career. Why has he been appointed to lead us? Now, of course, very quickly, Napoleon proves himself. And like I said, from this point onwards, it's all Napoleon. And I think at this point, I was also saying, this is when he starts to work with the Directory. Barras, in particular, is supporting him, is his patron. But I think it seems to me that Napoleon is also probably becoming a little more cynical at this point. I think especially working with the Directory, he knows how it works, right? It's all self-interest. He knows this. And so I think at this point we also see Napoleon really striking out on his own, trying to build his own reputation, building his own base of power, and building his own political power, sort of separate from his patrons and his allies.
Napoleon's military career only grew with his string of victories in northern Italy during 1796-97, where he galvanized the demoralized French soldiers under his command and earned a reputation as a fearsome general. His troops even fondly nicknamed him the Little Corporal for sharing in their dangers on the battlefield.
Yes, and the Little Corporal this is sort of a translation thing. It's not little, it's like a diminutive, but not in the sense little meaning small. That's not actually what it means. Little corporal, it's more like an endearing term, like, oh, our corporal, oh, the little corporal, right? That kind of thing. But when it gets translated to English, everyone thinks, oh, because he's so small. Like, no, that wasn't why.
With his decisive victory in the Italian campaign, Napoleon single-handedly forced the Austrians to sign a treaty which ended the War of the First Coalition, bringing about a fragile peace in Europe after 5 years of conflict.
Very fragile.
The people of France revered the victorious general.
And this is where, so first of all, this is where Napoleon starts to build his military career. This is extremely impressive. He's really building his political career, right? He's a very powerful man now. He's building his image amongst the people. He's a hero to the people of France. He's a military hero. And he also starts to build, Campo Formio. Napoleon always liked to bill himself as sort of a peace bringer, right? I don't fight because I want to. I fight because I have to. I am bringing peace and prosperity to France. Now, especially as time goes on, that's pretty ridiculous. Napoleon absolutely brought war to France. Now, I will say it's not always his fault, right? Like the other governments of Europe had it out for him, but Napoleon was just too ambitious not to march around Europe trying to conquer everybody, right? I'm sorry, he is not a peace bringer. At times he could be, but he just was not. But, this also sort of starts his reputation, or at least him trying to bill himself as a peace bringer.
As a hero and savior. It was here that Napoleon's path to despotism truly began, as he started to realize that he had won the war, not Robespierre, not the convention, and certainly not the current directory.
It seems to me that he knew that when he was in Italy. When you look at some of Napoleon's writings in Italy, he's already getting really, not maybe full of himself ain't the right word, because he is accomplishing great things, but he feels like he's a great figure of history already, right? Maybe a little preemptive. That especially accelerates when he goes to Egypt. He's doing a lot of things that he doesn't have the authority to do. He's very much acting like a Caesar in the field. The director is getting worried about him, but he's making political settlements, signing treaties. He's making serious political decisions on his own in the field in Italy, when he should be going back to the directory to ask them what to do. But first of all, that's impractical, obviously. This is why generals need a certain degree of authority in the field, because it's impractical to write back to the government about everything. But it also shows that he's really seeing himself as a powerful political figure. So yeah, I think he's already realized that by the time he gets back to France, but sure, he's in the process of sort of building his image and maybe thinking about what he can go on to do.
Famously remarked privately, "I am only at the beginning of the course I must run. I can no longer obey. I have tasted command,
right,
and I cannot give it up."
That was true.
The peace in Europe did not last, and within a year, Napoleon was planning his next campaign against the British in the War of the Second Coalition. He set his sights upon the vast deserts of Egypt, where he saw an opportunity to cut off the British Empire's trade connections to her colony in India. But more than that, Napoleon's campaign in Egypt was to be a scientific and cultural expedition, bringing...
Well, maybe not more than that. I think the military goal was the number one goal, but the sort of scientific goal and the historical and archaeological goals were certainly important too. And we recently did a reaction to Epic History TV's new video on Napoleon in Egypt, so you can check that out. I'll link it down below. But I do think the main goal was to challenge British domination, and that was the main justification. And I do think that was the main goal. I think once again it is sort of an extension of Napoleon's ambition, right? Wanting to build not just a European empire, but frankly a world empire. I know it sounds very grand, but he literally saw himself following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, right? Who built this massive continent-spanning empire. Multiple continents, I mean. So that's what Napoleon wanted to do, and he would not end up doing that. He would build a European empire, but that's what he was going for.
With him, France's best historians and scientists to study the land of the pharaohs and bring back riches and glory to the French people.
Yeah.
The campaign would ultimately end in military failure for the French. But politically, Napoleon's expedition had done what he had sought it to do. It served to increase his fame and popularity back home.
Yeah, no, that's very true. The French expedition to Egypt, in the end, like they said, militarily is basically a failure. But it certainly did not hurt Napoleon's image. In fact, it helped, right? I mean, he was already seen as a hero after his Italian campaigns. That was really cemented. And this was sort of just another exciting Napoleonic exploit that the French people could read about in the newspapers. And it was very exciting. Ooh, he's going to Egypt. He's uncovering all of this history, this science, these archaeological discoveries. This was sort of the beginning of, like, Egyptomania, as we call it. This sort of growing Orientalism in Europe. People were very interested in this idea of an exoticized Eastern world, and Napoleon was both playing into that and very much creating it with his expedition. So this just made people more excited about him, even though, if you look at the military objectives, it didn't go super well.
When Bonaparte returned to France in 1799, he received a hero's welcome.
Yeah.
Napoleon reached new heights of fame and glory, while the Directory reached a crisis point.
Yeah.
Corruption and greed plagued the Directory, and its legitimacy was cast into doubt. And Napoleon began seeking a way to seize power for himself, to take the reins of the revolution personally. Paris was already seething with political intrigue and backroom deals. He saw that the time had come to make his power play against the revolutionary government. He made a political alliance with a plotter in the Directory, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès.
Yeah, I mean, that's not quite what... I mean, okay, I'll tell you what happened. You can, I guess, make your own conclusions, right? Napoleon returns back to France, I think mainly because he sees the political situation is very tense, and one of the ways Napoleon built his image was by being in the right place at the right time, right? Being able to defend the Republican government from royalist protesters, rebels. He knows it's important to be back in Paris. He returns. Surely Napoleon was thinking what he was going to do himself, right? What sort of plot he was going to scheme up. But, I mean, we don't exactly know. What we do know is that Abbé Sieyès, who had been an important revolutionary leader from 1789, he's one of the original guys. And he's sort of been prominent, and he's back on the scene, right? And he has this plot to basically overthrow the Directory. It's a coup, right? The people hate the Directory. It's extremely corrupt. Like I said, it's just a bunch of guys. When you have years and years of revolutionary strife and violence, who ends up at the top? The survivors do. And what are the survivors focused on? They're focused on surviving, right? That's what they're focused on. Not necessarily on good, legitimate, idealistic governance. And so the people don't like the Directory. Sieyès, and he's working with one of Napoleon's brothers, actually. Napoleon's brothers are sort of involved in politics at this point. I think it's Lucien. I might be wrong there. Someone can correct me. But they basically decide to bring Napoleon into their plot, right? That's how it happens. The way they framed it is sort of Napoleon comes back, he has this idea, allies with Sieyès. It's actually more like Sieyès brings Napoleon into his plot, and then Napoleon quickly begins to dominate this plot, right? And so, I don't think we know if Napoleon had, like, some plot or coup of his own, but, like, surely he was thinking of something and happened to be brought into this one, which he would then basically become the leader of. And this coup, originally designed by Sieyès and his allies, would be almost entirely to the benefit of Napoleon himself,
who sought the popular general's support to take power. On November 9th, 1799, Napoleon's plot was set in motion. The plan was to force the dissolution.
Sieyès just wanted to basically use Napoleon as a tool, right? For two reasons. Napoleon could be, he could strike at the government in a way that they, as sort of politicians, couldn't. Him as a military man, he brings that military expertise. he also brings incredible popularity, right? The idea is that, yeah, the popular general, he brings the military side of things, and then he overthrows the government and allows us, the new politicians, to step in and take over. And, this is sort of a familiar formula, frankly. But Napoleon is just not that kind of general, right? He has ambitions and political ideas of his own. And I seem to remember the Bonaparte brother who was involved with Sieyès basically told him, hey, you gotta be careful. Like, if you get Napoleon involved, he will take over this plot. He will make this about and for him. And I guess Sieyès either didn't listen or thought, well, I can get around that, and he could not. That's exactly what Napoleon did.
Resolution of the Directory's legislature, vote in a new parliament, draft a new constitution, and effectively renew the government with a clean slate, with Bonaparte and Sieyès legitimately voted into power by the parliament. Sieyès, through his connections and bribery, would ensure that the other leaders of the Directory would be unable to oppose the motion. Napoleon gained the support of the other senior military generals for his plot, winning them over through bribes or his charm. Napoleon and his plotters believed that force would not be required to get such a resolution through, and they did.
Yeah, sometimes force isn't required. The threat of force. You know what I mean? They bring Napoleon in as this sort of violent weapon, but oftentimes just having the weapon is enough.
Didn't want to be
ideally, I mean, you don't actually want Napoleon and his men to start shooting people in the damn parliament, right? You just want them to be ready to shoot people so that everybody knows, all right, I better behave myself.
Seen as taking power through a military coup. Napoleon relied on the support of his brother Lucien, who had been elected president of the
it was Lucien.
lower house of the legislature, the Council of 500. He hoped that Lucien would be able to sway the legislators to dissolve the government, but the council refused to listen. Deliberations continued inside the chamber as Napoleon and his co-conspirators waited outside with growing impatience.
And this was a scene that was depicted in the new Ridley Scott movie that, I did not really enjoy that movie. It was definitely exaggerated, but I will say this whole takeover was a bit of a ridiculous mess. I mean, it did not go to plan. In the end, it worked, but I imagine it was quite a sort of ridiculous sight to see.
Finally, the young Corsican's patience grew thin, and he entered the building accompanied by a retinue of grenadiers to deliver a fiery speech to each chamber in turn. Although the Council of Ancients relented, the 500 refused to hear him out.
Yeah.
The deputies rose from their seats, shouting "hors la loi," or outside the law.
They stood up to straight up oppose him, and, whatever you think about the government, that is definitely commendable. You're faced with at this point, a pretty blatant military coup. Obviously the threat of being shot where you stand, and you decide to step up and say to Napoleon's face, like, no way, this ain't happening. Now, in the end, that opposition fades, but I do respect the glint of resistance, at least.
With some members even drawing daggers on Napoleon.
Yeah, they were ready to
Bonaparte
fight.
And his grenadiers were driven out of the chamber, and he noticed some of his generals were visibly hesitating on their next move.
Yeah.
Had the council declared Napoleon an outlaw, things might have gone differently. But their indecision would prove fatal to their power and the French Revolution as a whole. Drums beat outside as soldiers charged into the chamber accompanied by Napoleon. The deputies began to disperse quickly, many rushing to escape the frenzied scene through the room-level windows.
It's funny, the idea is that, hopefully we don't need to use military force, we can just be there as a threat. They want to basically do a political takeover that is a military coup, but they don't want it to look like a military coup. In the end, it's just a military coup, a very blatant military takeover.
In a quick and decisive coup, Napoleon had effectively dissolved the Directory. With the fall of the Directory...
I will say, you gotta give a shout out to Lucien. I think this was also depicted in the movie, though it's been a while at this point, actually. But Lucien, though he didn't manage to convince them initially, it was his charm, charisma, and speaking that did sort of bring things back around in the end. He gave a speech to the men. This was not necessarily Napoleon Bonaparte's finest moment. He got it done in the end, but he was a little bumbling, and he was a very charismatic guy, but in this moment, he could not necessarily find the charisma he needed to lead the politicians and lead his men. I think Lucien sort of stepped up as a civilian political leader, and I think maybe that was why it worked a little better. You know, some of the men were uncomfortable with all of this because it was becoming just a blatant military takeover. So you have the civilian politician Lucien step up. It's a little easier to listen to him because you can sort of pretend that it is not a blatant military takeover and that it is a good political action being taken for the good of the Republic.
Consulate was voted into power, in which 3 co-consuls would lead the French Republic: Napoleon, Sieyès, and a co-conspirator, Roger Ducos, later to be replaced by Charles-François Lebrun. But for all intents and purposes, Napoleon had consolidated power for himself as the first consul of the French Republic.
Yeah.
Much like the waning years of the Roman Republic, the true revolutionary ideals of liberty and fraternity faded away under the consulate, or rather dictatorship, of Napoleon. He had seen...
They did fade away, but Napoleon also spread them wide and far. This is where you get to the debate. But I do know that Kings and Generals has another video on, like, was Napoleon a tyrant or reformer? And we'll do that one as well. And I imagine we'll talk a lot more about that question there.
How the various governments and legislatures of revolutionary France had thrown the country into chaos and disarray, and Bonaparte intended to put an end to it by gaining absolute power. Working vigorously from his office in 17-hour workdays, Napoleon oversaw the rapid transformation of France from a republic into a one-man dictatorship. There were some positives out of Napoleon's consulship. He did away with the hectic revolutionary calendar, created a new legal codex known as the Napoleonic Code.
Yeah, I will say, you know, I just think it's difficult to give a simple conclusion about this. Like, and then Napoleon just, you know, he just ended the revolution and the revolutionary ideals faded away. Now, Napoleon certainly did, well, the revolution ended. You know what I mean? It was definitely over. I'll give you that. But in some ways, Napoleon did keep some of the ideas alive. And it's not like, I will say the thing I always point to, and look, I'm not pro like a dictatorship of any kind, but the Directory was terrible. People hated the Directory. It was not a great government in any way. And the fact that people were so dissatisfied that they were willing to accept Napoleon sort of shows you how much of a bad job the Directory was doing. And Napoleon, he was an authoritarian, and he used sort of deeply authoritarian and coercive politics. But in some ways, he did stabilize the Republic, though it was no longer a republic. And he introduced some things like the Napoleonic Code, which was this sort of modern liberal set of legislation and regulation and laws that he would then spread across Europe. And frankly, the Napoleonic Code, due to Napoleon's conquest and spreading of it, might be the most influential thing, or one of the most influential things that Napoleon has done to this day. I mean, it has been tremendously influential on sort of modern European politics, law, and history. It's really hard to explain how important it's been, and often doesn't get talked about enough. So yeah, it's always complicated with Napoleon.
The basis for much of modern Europe's legal codes, and also established general order and stability in France. But for all intents and purposes, the French Revolution, or at least the ideals it had birthed, died on November 9th, 1799.
Yeah, and I will accept that. You know, when you have Napoleon overthrowing the government and then eventually taking over as a dictator and an emperor, the revolution is definitely dead at that point, right? I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I do think some of the ideals did survive in altered and different forms.
Most Frenchmen didn't oppose the new consulship, as Napoleon brought stability to a France that had seen nothing but chaos and death for over 10 years. Napoleon went on to win another string of victories over the coalition forces in his second Italian campaign, culminating with the Battle of Marengo in 1800, which solidified Napoleon's status as first consul of France and ensured the new government's continued stability. Now holding uncontested absolute power over the French people, Napoleon would finally cement his rule over the country in 1804 by holding an election which made him Emperor of the French. Once an idealistic revolutionary like many of
Napoleon loved a good, what we call plebiscite, right? He would hold these elections that Napoleon only ever held an election he knew he was going to win, whether because he had genuine support or through tampering or a combination of the two. So Napoleon, in some ways, sort of wrote the modern political playbook of, all right, you give them elections so it sort of looks a little bit democratic, but it's not actually democratic because I'm in complete control, and if anything doesn't go my way, then, well, things will go my way, right? Of course, when you become emperor, sort of any facade of democracy starts to fall away, but hey, some of these tricks are still being used today.
his French brethren, Napoleon Bonaparte had subverted the ideals of the French Revolution for his own gains and become the very thing he had originally fought to oppose, an absolute monarch.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed our video on Napoleon's rise from artillery officer to emperor. We plan to cover the fascinating lives of history's other great leaders in the future, so make sure you are subscribed and...
Alright, very interesting. I definitely enjoyed this one. I thought this was a fascinating video. Like I said, Kings and Generals also has a video, was Napoleon a military tyrant or a reformer? And we're going to do that one as well, because it's sort of a similar topic, and we'll get to talk more. This was, ended up being... I really enjoyed this video, you know? I really enjoyed talking about the political side of things. This was sort of like a step-by-step narrative of Napoleon's subversion of the revolution. I imagine the was he a military tyrant or reformer will be a little more abstract, maybe a little more ideological, more about the ideas than the events. So we'll get to talk more about that in that one. But I think Napoleon's a very complicated guy. I find myself in some ways sympathetic to him, in other ways not, right? He achieved very impressive things, and he did do good things, but he did bad things, you know? Napoleon's treatment of the Haitian Revolution was just one of the most whack things he did. I'm really opposed to that, and I think the worst thing Napoleon did, really, was the endless warfare. You know what I mean? I think the lives lost, the destruction caused, I mean, that was the worst part. And I know that's the most bombastic part, and everyone loves to look at the battles, but truly the life lost, that's the humanitarian disaster. That's the worst part, in my opinion, of Napoleon's reign. And I mean, people at the time seemed to realize that as well. You know, when Napoleon was finally defeated, even though he had these great accomplishments and great military and political accomplishments, what people talked about, you look at like the Congress of Vienna, was the massive amount of life lost, right? It was a disaster. It was a total disaster. But I think someone who was so ambitious and he came to the throne, it's funny, he initially rose through his sort of political exploits, but then built his military career. He's very comparable to Caesar in a lot of ways. Napoleon came to the throne on the back of his military achievements, and through his ambition, he just couldn't stop himself, seemingly. He kept going. Now, like I said, there were some times when it wasn't his fault, and he was defending himself, but a lot of times, it was Napoleon's ambition getting the better of him, and he's having to go out, or feeling he had to go out and conquer Europe, which led to more and more death and destruction, right? So, there's that. That is really the dark side of Napoleon, and the authoritarianism, and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, he's a complicated character, you know? I think there was some good. I think the stabilization of France was good. I think in some ways he spread revolutionary ideas. Some of these ideas that would be the basis of modern European politics and law. He was massively influential. But even then, you get into the complex, you know, if you're spreading these sort of modern liberal ideas, which, I mean, I think is good in terms of just like efficient government, sort of modern legal codes. I think these are good things. That's what I mean by these modern liberal sort of Enlightenment ideas. That's good, but you're spreading them at the point of a gun, you know? You're forcing people to accept them. It's sort of the same as the whole, like, enlightened despot thing, or the authoritarian, like, well, I'm doing good things for you, but I'm forcing you, you know? You have no choice. It's like, well, is that really good? Yeah, he's a complicated character. I think, you know, if you set aside the moral questions, right? Because we're just doing it casually here. But I think if you're doing serious history, and it's not necessarily about the moral questions, I think he's extremely influential. And there's a lot of fascinating things you can look at with Napoleon and his achievements. I'm excited we got a chance to talk about them. I yapped a lot during this one, but it's because I really enjoyed it. I had a lot to say. I'm excited to get to that other Kings and Generals video. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.